Have you ever considered the possibility that the language you speak every single day, the very words you're using to process my voice right now, acts as an invisible cognitive operating system? Now imagine if that operating system was loaded with synthetic malware designed to dictate exactly how you perceive reality. Well, welcome to this explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating, highly radical strategic dossier. The source material we're looking at makes the claim that modern vernaculars, and it specifically targets English here, are actually laden with commercial bloatware, keeping users in a constant state of passive dependency. The dossier's proposed solution? Literally stripping away that corrupted operating system and transitioning entirely to a clean, low-level assembly language, Lucianic KOINE Greek. It's a massive, bold paradigm shift, so let's unpack exactly how this structural framework is actually built.
Okay, let's dive right into this cognitive roadmap. First, we'll look at the linguistic cognitive veil, then the translation trap, followed by reclaiming the soldier's tongue, the phonetic battleground, and finally, the execution plan for multi-generational linguistic sovereignty. All right, Section 1, the linguistic cognitive veil. In this specific framework, language is never just neutral. The text views language impartially as a highly effective, active tool, one used for either systemic subjugation or sovereign liberation. And right out of the gate, the dossier makes this shocking claim. It paints a picture of the English language as a bloated, sinking ship that's basically lost at sea. According to the text, centuries of continuous historical drift have turned English into what they call a subscription language, basically a medium where you don't actually own the definitions, you're just renting them from commercial institutions. The authors literally describe this as a neural anesthetic, engineered to induce a systemic ligation of the mind, effectively trapping users in this permanent state of passive, spiritual infancy. To really understand how this works, we have to look at their concept of an administrative fog. The source material argues that this linguistic confusion isn't just some random accident of history. It's framed as a deliberate smog of war. Think about it. Because modern definitions are so fluid, shifting constantly based on corporate structures or political tides or even just emotional contexts, the language creates this dense, synthetic cognitive veil. It takes distinct, absolute truths and collapses them into vague, singular terms. And according to the dossier, that makes it incredibly difficult for individuals to articulate objective reality, much less execute decisive action. And this brilliantly illustrates the high contrast dichotomy the dossier establishes. On one side, you have what it calls the merchant's tongue, which is English. It describes English as fluid, commercial, passive, and built heavily around negotiation and sentimental abstraction. Then, on the other side, you have the soldier's tongue, which is KOINE Greek. This is presented as a rigid, martial, active language that provides absolute, stable data. The text argues that if you want to achieve true clarity, you have to completely unplug from the language of the merchant and adopt the precise, case-locked vocabulary of the soldier. Moving right along to Section 2, the translation trap. So you might be wondering, if English is the fog, how exactly is that fog manufactured when we read historical or scriptural texts? Well, the dossier points directly at modern translation engines and a major mechanism it calls the transliteration veil. Now, transliteration simply mimics the phonetic sound of a word rather than translating its actual structural meaning. Notice that first row. The Greek word Christos becomes Christ. This hides its functional royal title, which actually means the anointed one. Below that, ecclesia becomes church, completely hiding the legal and political reality of a called-out assembly. And baptizo becomes baptize, which turns a physical, literal action of submersion into a religious ritual. The dossier argues this process creates a digital cordon that actively hides the true legal and sovereign realities of these foundational baseline terms. But it goes even deeper. Beyond transliteration, the text audits translation theory itself, specifically targeting something called dynamic equivalence, or thought-for-thought paraphrase. Look at the Greek phrase pistis Christou. Formal equivalence, which maintains objective structural mechanics, translates this as the faithfulness of Christ, right? It focuses on an objective external action. But notice how the modern dynamic shift translates it as faith in Christ. The dossier argues that this subtle shift literally changes everything for the reader. It overrides an objective structural reality with a subjective, highly individualistic and emotional concept, placing the entire burden back on human emotion. We see this exact same thing happen again with the KOINE verb miseo. Now, in Hellenistic legal contexts, this word indicated a formal legal repudiation or placing something in a secondary priority, and it's often translated into English as hate. However, because modern translators find this a bit jarring, Dynamic translations often soften it to something like to love less. The source material argues this softening completely erases the strict operational reality of the text. It takes a non-negotiable structural command of priority and turns it into a vague, sentimental feeling on an emotional spectrum. Section 3. Reclaiming the soldier's tongue. Having laid out the massive problem of the English linguistic veil, the dossier proposes a radical solution, literally unplugging from the merchant's tongue and reverting back to the uncorrupted source code. But why KOINE Greek? Well, because it contains mathematical, case-locked linguistic tools, what the text actually terms the aspect gasket and the aorist stent. Think of these tools as an unhackable firewall for your mind. You see, unlike English, which focuses incredibly heavily on when something happened, the Greek aorist aspect presents reality as a hardened, uncorrupted snapshot. It's a completed event. This prevents unauthorized semantic shifting and fixes reality as objective and totally unhidden. So the crucial point to take away here is that this entire framework rests on 3 pillars of the KOINE artery. First, precision, or acrobeia, which is enforced by a highly mathematical case system where suffixes dictate the exact legal function of a word. Second, militant structure, utilizing aorist imperatives. The text describes these as flash commands that demand immediate point-action execution rather than just offering a polite suggestion. And third, historical context, acting as the original unifying common tongue that just completely bypasses modern ideological drift. The text basically views adopting these 3 pillars as the ultimate act of cognitive liberation. Which brings us to Section 4, the phonetic battleground. Interestingly, the dossier argues that it is not just the grammar that matters. The very acoustic frequency, the pronunciation of the language, is a tactical battleground. The source material claims that mainstream academia uses an artificial 16th century pronunciation system called the Erasmian model, which the dossier bluntly labels an academic compromise. The Erasmian model is described as soft, anglicized, separated, and low velocity. It aggressively contrasts this with the reconstructed 1st century Lucian phonology, the actual gritty spoken language of the Mediterranean dirt. That pronunciation is plosive, hard, and high velocity, specifically designed for direct kinetic impact. The text asserts that using the Erasmian pronunciation systematically demilitarizes the text, turning a raw soldier's command into a polite, stuffy academic lecture. Now, to hear how this sounds in practice, let's look at the acoustic impact for the simple word meaning and. The academic Erasmian uses a theatrical, drawn-out kai, like the word aisle, which completely breaks the rapid transition of the sentence. But the 1st century Lucian is just a crisp, rapid k. Or, notice the word meaning having deployed. The Erasmian artificially splits the vowels into this clunky, multisyllabic po re u thentis. It's sluggish, right? The Lucian snaps with a sharp fricative, porothentis. The dossier strongly advocates for this high-frequency, breath-driven rhythm to fully restore the authoritative command of the language itself. Finally, Section 5, multi-generational linguistic sovereignty. So how does one actually execute this monumental transition? Well, the dossier provides a tactical escape plan. It's a phased execution framework meant to take place over generations, literally called the Vanguard acquisition stack. Phase 1 is auditory imprinting, enforcing that 1st century Lucian phonology right from the start. Phase 2 is direct visual mapping. Now, this is absolutely critical. They enforce a strict no-glossy rule, meaning you never translate the Greek back into English, ever. You associate the words directly with physical actions and objects to bypass the English operating system entirely. Phase 3 utilizes standalone stacks for direct, isolated immersion. And Phase 4 develops syntactic intuition through massive comprehensible input, having students read graded Hellenistic prose until the brain literally thinks natively in the target tongue. And the ultimate goal of this entire framework is what they call a total air gap, or aphorismos. Much like taking a highly secure computer completely offline to prevent it from being hacked, the dossier enforces a strict separation from English translation drift. By doing this, it claims a household can achieve permanent linguistic sovereignty. It's all about moving far away from the passive dependency of modern language and reaching a state of teleos, which is defined here not as some impossible moral perfection, but as functional completion, maturity, and absolute mission readiness. It is about no longer being reliant on the commercial paradigms of the English language whatsoever. We've explored a highly complex and provocative framework today, one that challenges the very foundation of how we communicate, think, and process the world around us. So I want to leave you with this final lingering thought.
Does your native language act as an invisible cognitive veil, subtly shaping and perhaps severely limiting your understanding? Or does it truly equip you with the structural sovereignty to perceive unhidden reality? It's a fascinating question that forces us to examine the very tools we use to build our thoughts. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the architecture of your own reality.